All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation of Your Freedom Hub's free market patient and free market doctor. I'm your host, Jeff Cantor, along with my co-host, Charles Froman. We're sponsored by Your Freedom Hub and a host of other great sponsors of late. Just so you do know, we are recording this and it will be released on Mondays at all three of these channels, so whichever one you prefer. And please either subscribe and share links as well. Always good to get some more circulation on there. And as I said, we have a sponsorship, but before I get over there for one, Nick, just to show you, these are some of the channels that these videos reside on, and there's an awful lot of them. And a lot of them, even if they're a year old type of thing, you could watch them and you'd think we just recorded them. The stuff is very, very current. And there's some really fantastic guests on here. Here's we are up on YouTube as well. So as I said, we have some sponsorship. So here's a rather interesting situation. We have found, because we've been getting approached and do these shows and learn about a lot of different things, the only really bioreactive operational hemp product on the market. And in fact, there's a special version going to be coming out for doctors very soon, and they're giving us a special pricing discount for anyone that wants to sample the stuff. They have a doctor's challenge where the doctor is able to bring all their patients and any other products, whatever the other product is, try it, and then they have some neuromuscular maneuvers, and they test one against the other. And this stuff typically works within 3 seconds of application. So there's some pretty remarkable videos up on their site that kind of show you what happens in that regard. And if you use this particular code, instead of getting like 5 or maybe even 10%, they're going to be a 15% discount here. So you'll hear more about this as time goes forward. They're really getting ready to start changing things up big time in the industry. And then now let's shift gears, because today was going to be yet again another exciting day with some very, very good topic that we don't get here addressed enough. So Charles, if you'll do the honors.
Sure, Jeff, and Jeffrey Singer, welcome.
Thank you.
Jeff is a well-known libertarian doctor. He is the founder and principal at Valley Surgical Clinics, the oldest surgical center in Arizona. And given his interest in commenting on all the political issues around healthcare, he is now with the Cato Institute as a senior fellow. And he is a member of the board of health advisors for a council on health and science as an influential national body. And he's going to talk about a big issue with libertarians and free market organizations, and that's licensing. It's a barrier to entry and usually gets litigated in legislation in the state legislatures around people that are in the companies fixing hair. It's low-level stuff. The licensing issue rarely rises to the big occupations like lawyers or doctors. But if you don't take on the big ones with licensing, you're not going to make big impacts on the supply of the good. So we're excited to talk about that, as well as the impact of immigration restrictions on doctors coming here to practice. There's good doctors from around the world. It's hard for them to practice here. So in general, the supply restrictions on doctors, which by limiting their numbers, jacks up their price and restricts quality. So maybe call it doctor protectionism. So Dr. Singer is going to talk about how to repeal doc protectionism.
A needed topic. So I've given you control. You're welcome to bring your slides up.
I'll share the screen right now. Here goes. And let's go to play from the start. So thank you for asking me to speak. This is me. And the reason I call it a folly is because, as we learned from this pandemic, licensing laws have stood in the way of getting healthcare rapidly deployed to areas where it's in need. So during the early days of this pandemic, many governors started to issue executive orders essentially suspending most of the licensing requirements. It started in the Northeast. I think the first state to do it was Massachusetts, but it started obviously where the pandemic hit the hardest in the beginning, the Northeastern states, but eventually many, many states one thing they did was they suspended licensing requirements for out-of-state licensed doctors. So under ordinary circumstances, I'm licensed in Arizona. If I wanted to go to New York City to help out with the pandemic, I wouldn't be allowed to because I'm not licensed to practice medicine in New York. So in New York State, the governor said, we'll accept any person who's licensed anywhere in the United States, not just doctors, nurses, nurse practitioners. Come on in, we need your help. Telemedicine was a similar thing. Every state, including my state of Arizona, which has done some good reforms, restricts the practice of telemedicine to states in which in your own state. You can't practice telemedicine out of state. So I could take care of a patient in my state using telemedicine, but if I wanted to take care of a patient in a neighboring state, I can't unless I have a license to practice medicine in that state, which is kind of ironic because when you think about it, and I've said this before, let's say, I developed some really exotic kind of condition, and there's a guy at UCLA who's the world-renowned expert on this, and I get an appointment, I get in my car, I drive the 6 hours from Phoenix to Los Angeles, I see this doctor, spends some time with me, gives me some prescriptions, and he wants to follow up with me in 3 months. It'll be a brief 10-minute visit. I can't follow up with that doctor by telemedicine unless that doctor gets a license in Arizona. I have to either get on a plane or get back in my car and go to LA to spend 10 minutes with this guy because of licensing requirements. So the governors of most states suspended the requirement that you have a license in the state in which you're practicing telemedicine. But both of these suspensions were for the duration of the emergency. These are temporary. But that was a tacit admission that the state medical licensing laws block the free flow of practitioners to patients in need. So it should beg the question, if it was important when you had this dire emergency, then why should you go back to the way it is and wait for the next dire emergency? Shouldn't you be asking yourself, should we get rid of these laws that are obstructions? So a little bit of history. Probably most of the people on this webcast are familiar with this, but the American Medical Association was founded in 1847 with the express mission of licensing medical practitioners. That was its raison d'etre. In those days, in the early days of medicine, when there wasn't a lot of scientific information, there were several competing schools of thought. There were homeopaths, allopaths. Osteopaths didn't come around until the 1890s. There were what they called eclectics. There are people who, anyway, there are various schools, but the AMA represented allopathic physicians and wanted to make sure that they were the only ones and that they dominated. So they tried to get states to license doctors. Now, back in the early days, they were basically hit a whole bunch of dead ends. They would lobby before state legislatures, asking them to pass licensing laws, because under our federal system, the states have the police power. They have the right, if they so desire, to license occupations because they could act in the public health and welfare of their citizens. It's not a federal issue. So they started lobbying state legislatures, and most of them were coming back to them and saying, license to practice medicine? You don't need a license. Just practice. This is a free country. Just do what you are trained to do. Well, you never know. There may be some bad doctors out there. Well, if there are bad doctors out there, they won't last very long, will they? Or they'll get sued or something. So that was the original reaction. But after the Civil War, a lot changed in this country. And by the late 1800s, the notion of occupational licensing in general became more accepted by a lot of states. And so and the AMA, what they decided to do was organize a network of state chapters. These state chapters then lobbied at the state legislature. And they began to make some headway so that by the turn of the century, most of the states had created licensing laws for healthcare practitioners. They actually, I don't want to get too into the weeds. If you're interested in this, I'm going to recommend a book to you in a minute, but they actually teamed up with their number one competitors, the homeopathic doctors. And every homeopathic doctor was given an allopathic license in return for teaming up with them, because they constituted a majority of practicing physicians at that time. So anyway, they got states to put into place licensing laws, and the licensing laws generally were staffed originally by the state chapter of the AMA. Eventually, that changed, but still to this day, the AMA, of course, the state chapter has tremendous influence over what the licensing boards do and say and their policies. So they were very successful. In the early days, you couldn't get a license unless you joined the state chapter of the AMA. So it's sort of like in Hollywood, you know, if you want to act, you can't get an acting position unless you have a SAG card, but you can't get a SAG card unless you've done some acting. Same kind of thing. That was what was happening with medicine. So medicine began to the allopathic profession began to develop kind of hegemony. They also created a situation. These licensing boards would not allow a license to anyone who didn't graduate a medical school that's not accredited by the AMA, and that exists to this day. So the AMA got to pick, you know, what medical schools count. They also discriminated against doctors who chose to enter into prepayment arrangements, like working for companies like Kaiser, for example, or a lot of doctors worked out arrangements with mutual aid societies, like let's say the Knights of Columbus. They would try to contract with a doctor to be the doctor for the members. That was taboo because they wanted to preserve the fee-for-service model. So a lot of times they actually kick you out of the state chapter of the AMA, and they would lobby the state licensing board to deny you a license. In 1910, the American Medical Association teamed up with the Carnegie Foundation to commission the Flexner Report. Abraham Flexner was a nationally renowned education expert. He was an educator. And they asked him, tell us what you think an ideal medical school should be like. Because in those days, some medical schools were 2 years, some were 4, some didn't require a college undergraduate degree. Some were more like sort of apprenticeships where you do like a year of a medical school and then you work with a doctor in the practice. Now, of course, this is when medicine was simpler too. It wasn't nearly as technologically sophisticated. It was more primary care oriented stuff. So Flexner came out with a report recommending the model we know today, which is you have to have an undergraduate degree, very steeped in research, basic science training, generally 4 years. And as a result, the AMA, of course, endorsed that, and then state licensing boards basically, the AMA stopped accrediting any schools that did not meet the Flexner Report's recommendations. As a result, you can see on the slide here, there was a dramatic reduction in the number of medical schools in the United States that were accredited, including African-American medical schools. They went down to just 2, Meharry and Howard University. And ironically, the African-American medical schools had a much better student-teacher ratio. Also, schools became much more expensive. So as a side effect of that, what we saw was that a lot of, prior to the Flexner Report, about 50% of doctors were women. And there were a lot of women and a lot of minorities and a lot of low-income people practicing medicine. But after 1910, you really couldn't afford to go to medical school unless you had money. So the demographics changed. It generally became something that only, basically wealthy people could afford to send their kids to medical school. We all know what licensing laws do. The advocates of licensing laws, whether you're talking about a plumber's license or a doctor's license, the advocates always say this is for the safety of the public, but almost never does the public go to the legislature and say, please license these people. We feel that we're not safe. It's always the other way around. And there's an ulterior motive, which is to restrict competition. And of course, that infringes on the right to earn an honest living, rarely protects consumers, and like I said, really initially sought by consumers. I highly recommend, if you haven't already read this book, because I know we have a sophisticated audience, this book by Paul Starr, it came out in 1984, The Social Transformation of American Medicine, The Rise of a Sovereign Profession and the Making of a Vast Industry, gets into the entire history of the medical profession and how it rose from, in our country, in the early days, doctors actually had to have 2 jobs, one as a doctor and one as another, just to make a living. And they oftentimes traveled from town to town, and they worked very carefully and within the law to create the cartel that we have today. And the history is fascinating. And and some of it is kind of ironic too. It's like they made the bed they slept in. So originally the doctors kind of created the hospitals to work for them, and they pretty much were in charge of the hospitals. Now, of course, the hospitals are the employers of about 2/3 of doctors. But I recommend that book to you if you're interested in pursuing this subject in more depth. Now, it's important for people, the public, to understand. People think that if you're licensed, that means that you're safe. But in fact, the licensing, which is pretty much the licensing requirements in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, are virtually identical. So they don't really provide. They only kind of do like basically a cursory safety check. So they check to make sure that you don't have any criminal convictions and that kind of thing, or you've been thrown off of staffs of hospitals because of malfeasance or malpractice. They check to make sure you took the national medical licensing exam. You went to an accredited medical school, but that's about it. Nevertheless, even though they're identical in every state, you got to go through the same process in every state. So, which is, again, there's a redundancy here. Even though I'm going to have to show my neighboring state of New Mexico everything I showed my state of Arizona, I can't just say to New Mexico, look, I have a license in Arizona. Could you just give me a license here now? Like can be done with, in most cases, with a driver's license. Instead, I got to go through the whole process. I got to get my diploma from medical school from years ago. I got to show proof that I passed these exams, all that kind of stuff. And then they have to go and check through all my records to make sure that everything I said in my application is true, even though it was just done next door in Arizona. And of course, you have to pay the fee, which could run into lots of money after every single state. But once you're licensed, a lot of people don't realize this, I could do anything I want to. So I happen to be trained as a general surgeon, but if I decided I'm really interested in psychiatry, and lately, by the way, I've gotten really interested in addiction medicine because of the work I've been doing. There's nothing that prevents me from putting up a shingle on my office door and saying I'm a psychiatrist or an addiction specialist, and presenting myself to the public that way and practicing it. And by the way, I might be very good at it because I might have gone to a lot of courses and CME classes and read a lot, and maybe I am good at it. But there's nothing that prevents me from doing that. So, what is it that really checks out whether or not I'm safe? Well, it's this private sector credentialing and certifying organizations. So, for example, if I want to present myself to the public as a general surgeon, the American Board of Surgery provides certification exams. And, you have to first convince them that you've trained in a postgraduate training program in surgery that meets their specifications. And then you have to take a certification exam. And nowadays, almost every specialty board requires recertification every so often. And now, and this is controversial among us doctors, we don't like this, but a lot of them, I think this is a money-making deal for them, but they have a thing called maintenance certification. So not only do you have to take the exam again every 5 to 10 years, depending on what the specialty is, but you got to continue throughout the year taking courses that are accredited by the certifying board to show that you're maintaining your level. But those are the organizations and they're private, nonprofits. Those organizations out there are actually doing due diligence for the consuming public. And they're not a monopoly. So for example, there's the American Board of Medical Specialists, which is the largest association of boards that certify specialists. There are 25 different specialty boards and 147 subspecialty boards, but they compete with the American Board of Physician Specialists, which has 18 specialty boards, the American Osteopathic Association, and there are several others, but these are the 3 big ones. And there are also institutes that certify the certifiers, just like you have, reinsurance that insures the insurance companies, or you have credentialing organizations that credential the certifying organizations. The biggest one, the most well-known one, is the Institute for Credentialing Excellence, or ICE, not that ICE, this ICE. And the organization that works under it is called the National Commission for Certifying Agencies. And they're constantly reviewing the various certification boards to determine whether or not, they think they're meeting adequate criteria, and giving them this, they give a seal of approval. Even among certain specialties, for example, spine surgery is one that comes to mind, plastic surgery, cosmetic surgery, I think, and I think pain management. There are multiple accredited certifying boards that you could seek certification from. So your cosmetic surgeon may be certified by, now I don't remember all the names, but one could be the American Board of Cosmetic Surgery, or that surgeon could be certified by the American Board of Plastics and Reconstructive Surgery. You, the consumer, decide. They're both credentialed by the NCCA. You, the consumer, decide whether or not that matters to you, or as long as they're certified by one or whatever. But I'm pointing out that there's actually a competitive market out there that's really responsible for the safety to the consumer. And let's face it, whatever we're consuming, we like information, whether it's about a movie or about a computer we're about to buy or a car. There's a market for information, and also for evaluation and review. We need that information to make our decisions as consumers. But it's not just the certification agencies. Hospitals and insurance companies go do due diligence as well. Most hospitals will not let you practice in a specialty at that hospital unless you're board certified in that specialty, or depending on your level of training, because a lot of times you can't become board certified until you've been practicing in that specialty for a couple of years. That's the requirement of the certifying board. If they see that you're on track for that, you're what they call board eligible, they may grant you privileges providing you get certified by a deadline. So I could decide I'm a psychiatrist tomorrow and start practicing in my community. But if I apply for privileges as a psychiatrist at a hospital, they're going to ask me, where did I do my psychology, my psychiatry postgraduate training? Did I take my boards in it? And when I tell them, well, I actually did a surgical residency, I took my boards in surgery, I don't think they're going to approve me for psychiatry privileges at the hospital, even though I may be excellent. But that's another credentialing, stopgap. Then, of course, the insurance companies, when nowadays, particularly if you want to get on a panel, the insurance companies don't want to get sued, and they want to compete with other health plans, saying we have the finest doctors and the specialties in the world, all that kind of stuff. So they also do due diligence. Some of them are requiring board certification for you to be listed on their panel as a specialist. Some aren't. But again, these are all different ways in which the private sector is doing the work that a lot of people in the general public think is being done by the licensing board, but are not. You can see the licensing board is really superfluous when it comes to safety. There's also consumer rating sites like Health Grades and Vitals, Rate Providers. There are many more. Leapfrog and Consumer Reports are well known for rating hospitals and healthcare facilities. So there's radical reform. There's the reform, that as a libertarian we like to see, which is get rid of licensing, make it back to where legislatures would say, licensing, you don't need a permission to practice an honest living. But as reformers, we need to think about how can we convince the legislators and the public, because the public is now so accustomed to this regime that they might get very frightened to suggest ending licensing. So how can we transition? I jokingly say, a lot of my colleagues, when I'm at the doctor's lounge at the hospital, they really like me when they hear me talk about the problems with Obamacare and with how private practice, direct care medicine is a great alternative. They love me. But when I bring up the subject of why do we have to be licensed, they look at me like I have two heads. So, because so many, we're born and raised into this regime, so it almost sounds crazy to suggest challenging the licensing regime. I understand that. That's what we're used to. Here's an interesting kind of example of a transition, sort of a hybrid. I actually have an op-ed I wrote about this that is pending right now. It's being pitched by our Cato people, and hopefully in the next couple of days it'll be accepted by a publication, and then I'll get it out there to everybody. But then most people don't realize how the architects work this out. They have a thing called the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards, or NCARB. And actually, this organization came about in 1919. Now, just like doctors, architects actually, bad architects could be a threat to the public health and safety, right? I mean, buildings can collapse, people could die, that kind of thing. So architecture is very important. So back in the early 20th century, there was this hodgepodge of different licensing requirements in different states. But not only that, just think about this: if you're an architect and you're particularly nowadays, and you're working on multiple projects, and you could be one project that you're working on, a skyscraper in Chicago, but then you're also working on one in Singapore. And then there's a medical office building you're designing in Los Angeles. So you got to be able to move around from place to place. And if you have to apply for licenses in all of these places, it becomes, it's just unworkable. So back in 1919, this private nonprofit organization was created, and basically had the mission of standardizing the licensing rules in all of the different states. It was basically trying to convince them of all having the same standards. But it evolved into a situation where now all 54 states and territories, I know there are no 54 states, there are 50 states and there are 4 territories, plus the District of Columbia, as well as Canada, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, and they're working on a similar arrangement with several Asian Pacific countries like Singapore, and they probably were working on it with Hong Kong. I don't know where that stands now, but they basically, in those places, if you're certified by the National Council of Architecture Registration, because they have a certification process where you take an exam, the same kind of thing as with medical board certification. If you have a certificate, then you're granted a license automatically. So if you want, as an architect, you could apply for an architecture license in your state, but you'd be wise to also at the same time get yourself NCARB certified. Then if you decide, I want to get a license in 3 other states, all you have to do is apply for them, have the NCARB send to that licensing board your certificate, your certification, and your license is granted. Of course, you got to pay them the licensing fee, but that's it. So, the other interesting thing about NCARB is it doesn't just require you to graduate from an accredited architecture program at a university. They have 2 alternative pathways, which I can envision happening in healthcare, for example, for those who've done substantial work but didn't go through the standard architecture degree accreditation program. So, for example, let's say you were working as an assistant to an architect, as a draftsman or something like that, and over the years you've gotten really good at it, and you think you could be an architect. So they have ways of testing you, looking at the experience level you have, and if you meet their criteria, even though you didn't get a degree in architecture from a college, they'll grant you an architecture certification. And that'll get you to practice in the 54 states and territories, the District of Columbia, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a kind of interesting transition, because the first question that would probably come to any of our minds is, okay, so if we have that, then basically we have certification replacing licensing. So then why do we have to get a license as an architect? Isn't that just a redundancy? It's basically, I'm just having to pay tribute to this government agency, which is going to grant me the license anyway, because I got my certification. Why don't we just get rid of the licensing and just have the states recognize that if you are certified by NCARB, and by the way, they should recognize not just NCARB, but any, let's say, NCCA accredited certifying organization, then you could practice. You could practice architecture in our state. Why do we have to even keep the licensing regime? Let it just wither away. Good question. But anyway, the architecture example is sort of a good model to point to when you want to point to what we could do in our country. In our country, I could. And by the way, on August 4th, Michael Cannon and Shirley Svorney, who's at Cal State Northridge, have co-authored a policy analysis that'll be coming out on August 4th. It's embargoed until then, which makes the case of converting to a third-party certification regime. Now, granted, as a libertarian, this isn't pure, right? Because you still have to have the state in statute recognize third-party certifying organizations that are private sector, as opposed to, you shouldn't even have to have that. You shouldn't need that permission to practice your livelihood. I understand that. But this is a great improvement, because what also it does is when you have, instead of the government, the legislature being the determinant of what will give you a license. And of course, then the government gets into all these scope of practice debates, right? Like if you're a nurse anesthetist, you can't practice without having an anesthesiologist, just outside the room, let's say. Or if you're a nurse practitioner, you can't practice certain things, or a physician's assistant. Those are all rules set by the government, which involves a whole bunch of special interest pleading and rent seeking and protectionist activities and turf battles. But if you have private, particularly competing certifying organizations, then you open up situations like we just described with the alternative pathways in architecture, where the certifying organization could say, you might be a nurse practitioner, or you might have been a Navy corpsman, and you got a lot of experience, doing minor surgery when you were in the Navy and suturing up abdomens, et cetera, et cetera. And now you're applying for permission to do, let's say, minor surgeries like office surgeries, vasectomies, things like that. We're going to certify you for that because you've convinced us based on your experience level. So those kind of things could develop. Whereas when it's up to politicians making that decision, of course, then different lobbying groups lobby the politicians and try to influence their decision. So when it's in the market is making this decision, and it's always subject to competition. There's no monopoly being granted. So moving to a third-party certification system is certainly a great improvement over what we have right now. Now, let's talk about international medical graduates, because they're also victims of our licensing regime. So if you've graduated from there's dozens and dozens of medical schools around the world that are approved by the Education Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates, which was created by the American Medical Association and a couple of other organizations, Association of American Medical Colleges, and they're an independent nonprofit accrediting agency. I don't know how independent they really are because they're influenced by their creators, but they credential medical schools in other countries. So if you graduate, let's say you're from, you're from Saudi Arabia and you graduated a medical school there that's accredited by ECFMG, let's say it's or Lebanon, the American University of Lebanon Medical School, and you want to do a residency in the United States. You're fresh out of medical school. Well, of course, step one, you got to get a visa. That's hard as it is. But if you want to get into a residency in this country, providing you have that's you're coming straight out of medical school, you could apply for a residency program, and if you were to get a visa, you got to go through you could get into any residency program that any graduate of an American or Canadian medical school can get into. And you have to take the same U.S. medical licensing exam that every other American or Canadian medical school graduate would have to take to get a license to practice in any of the 54 states and territories and District of Columbia. So the hard part really is to get a visa. And I could tell you, because I'm involved with a residency program at one of my main teaching hospitals, my partner, he actually is very involved in it, and he's an immigrant. He's from Iran originally. And he hates to say this because he's very sympathetic to immigrants. But unless you're a major institution like a university residency program, you don't have the financial resources to try to get a visa for these applicants. So even though you could have a very attractive applicant for your residency program, usually, he tells me, if they're from another country, even if it's an ECFMG accredited medical school, they just pass on them because they don't have the wherewithal to go through getting them a visa to come to the United States for their program. But theoretically, they can do that. But let's say instead you graduated that ECFMG approved medical school, you went and did a residency there, You got board certified there, and you've been practicing there. In fact, we're gonna have a week from today at noon Eastern, the Cato Institute. Please feel free to join it. We're gonna have a conference all about this called Doctors with Borders, Embracing the Role of Immigrant Doctors. And one of those immigrant doctors is a colleague of mine here in Phoenix, is going to be one of the guests on the program. So his story is a classic story. So he graduated an ECFMG approved medical school in Pakistan, did a residency in physiatry. That's rehab medicine for those lay people out there. These are people who take care of like spinal cord injuries, stroke victims, etc. And not only did he complete his residency, but he was also on the faculty of the medical school in that. He was practicing it for a number of years. He wanted to come to the United States. If that's the case, even though you did all that, you have to repeat the entire residency process all over again, start from scratch. So the only way an international medical graduate can get here easily is if they didn't do the residency process yet, and they do that here. But if you've done that elsewhere, you got to do that all over again. He actually came to America. He really wanted to come here. He was sharing an apartment with two other Pakistani immigrants, working in a laundry in Coney Island, Brooklyn, until a residency program opened up that he could get into. And it was a residency program in oncology, which was not what he's trained to do or had wanted to do. But he said, I'll take it. It was in Kentucky. So he went to Kentucky and trained in oncology. Now he's a fantastic oncologist. He's a director of the Palo Verde Cancer Center in Scottsdale. I refer my patients to him. He refers his patients to me. But, you know, all this guy had to go through. And think about all the people who just don't have the ability. They have a family to take care of, you know. So you see a lot of people who are actually trained medical specialists who are working as orderlies in hospitals or driving cabs or, you know, owning a diner, and these are doctors. And look at that talent going to waste. In my surgical practice at one of the hospitals, there's this OR tech named Jamil, who I was always impressed while he's passing instruments to me. His head was always in the case. I was really impressed compared to all the other OR techs. These are the people who pass the instruments to the surgeon. He was like focused on the case, paying attention to everything going on. And every once in a while, when I was struggling with making a particular intraoperative decision, he would say, can I suggest something? And he'd suggest something. I say, well, that's a good idea, Jamil. I think I'm going to do that. And then one day I actually asked him, I said, you seem to really know a lot of how this works. How do you know so much? And he says, well, I was a general surgeon back in Syria. But I just was no position to do a residency all over again in the United States. I got a wife and kids. So I still love surgery so much. I was able to get a job as an OR tech at the hospital, and I have a Middle Eastern diner. Maybe you'll come to it. So there's another story that I have. So this is a common story. And what's standing in the way, of course, is licensing. Now, a lot of other countries don't do this. Just to our north, Canada, they have a thing called, well, first of all, in Canada, they have a list of 29 foreign jurisdictions that if you have a license to practice in them, so you're already, you know, like I say, an established doctor, they'll just, you take the same exam that every other Canadian doctor has to take to get their license, and then you're granted a license. On the other hand, if you're not from one of those, and some of the provinces, because each province is different, some of them will have a provisional license. Like you take the same exam, they may require a language proficiency exam, and then you have a doctor who has agreed to supervise your practice for, let's say, 6 months. And then that doctor has to certify to the licensing board, yes, this doctor is competent. Then you're on your own. Then you don't have any ties to that doctor. In Nova Scotia, which is a underserved area of Canada, they make an exception for primary care doctors who aren't from those 29 approved countries. They basically will give you a provisional license. You work under supervision for 1 year. And then if that doctor who supervises you says you're competent, you're given a license, providing you practice in an underserved area for 3 years. So that's what they do in Canada. In Australia, they have a similar kind of regime. We're going to get into all of this at our conference next week. New Zealand does too. Most of the EU member countries offer provisional licenses, but because of the many different languages spoken in Europe, many of them require that you pass a language proficiency exam before they'll grant you a license, but they give you a provisional license as well. So even if you've been practicing in some other country, that's fine. You're welcome to come to the European Union and practice there. France's system is similar to our system, which, by the way, should tell you something, because France is basically, a bureaucratic socialist democracy, and it's kind of no compliment that their licensing regime is similar to ours. So what are immediate term reforms that we can do about this whole licensing mess? Well, Arizona was the first state to do this. I'm proud of this. In 2019, we passed occupational licensing reform. So it's not just medical, it's any occupation. If you hold a license in good standing for at least 1 year in any other state in the union, in anything that's licensed in our state, then you will be granted a license automatically. You'll be granted reciprocity. Unfortunately, you still got to register with our state's licensing board and pay the fee, of course, but no hassles, no waiting period, you granted it. The other downside is you have to establish a domicile or a practice in our state. Doesn't mean it has to be only here, but you have to have an office in our state. So if you're a doctor from Colorado and you also want to have a license in Arizona, you can get it, but you better have an actual bricks and mortar location in Arizona for people to come see you. So, but still, that's good. Since that time, Pennsylvania, Montana, and Missouri have passed similar legislation. Every state should do that. Telemedicine reform. It's going to go back to the way it was when this pandemic passes. So again, Cato came out with a policy analysis on this by Shirley Svorny a couple of years ago. There's a simple fix, which is, and this is in keeping with Congress's authority under the Commerce Clause, which is to break down barriers for interstate commerce between the states. They could just say in statute that for the purpose of telemedicine, the locus of care is defined as the state in which the healthcare practitioner is licensed, as opposed to the state in which the recipient of the healthcare lives. So that's an easy fix. So I could then, get through telemedicine, see that doctor in UCLA because he's licensed in California. That's the locus of care. I happen to be in Phoenix receiving his medical care and advice, but he's licensed in California. That's the locus of care. So that's an easy fix. I'm very happy to say, this is April or so, the Cato, Jeff Vanderslice, who's our Director of Government Affairs, arranged for a meeting between me and Senator Ted Cruz and his chief of staff, as well as our CEO, Peter Gettler. And we discussed this with him, and he's introduced a bill co-sponsored with Mike Lee that would do that. Except, unfortunately, it only does it every time there is a public health emergency declared by, the Department of HHS. We said, why can't you just make it permanent? And he said, first things first, let's get this done. And then we could, get the camel's nose under the tent and go from there. I'm not a political strategist, legislative strategist, so I'm not going to argue with him. But the point, making some headway, the idea is out there. So the bill has been introduced. Another thing states can do right now is start granting provisional licenses to international medical graduates. They could, follow a model such as Canada or Australia or so many of the other developed countries that do that. So that these are immediate term reforms. Ideally, these reforms shouldn't just apply to physicians. They should apply to all licensed health professions. Ideally, of course, they should apply to every licensed occupation, not just healthcare licensing occupations. And a good step in that direction is to work towards replacing licensing with third-party certification. But I would view, as a libertarian and as a believer in free markets and competition and an anti-protectionist, I would view replacing licensing with certification, again, as a step, not as the final step, because ideally you shouldn't have to get the state to give you permission to practice an honest living, providing you're certified by one of several certification agencies recognized by that state. But it's, again, it's sort of like privatizing licensing. Just like privatizing Social Security private accounts is better than the government owns monopoly Social Security system we have today. So replacing it with third-party private certifications is sort of like privatizing licensing in a certain respect. And it's working us towards that way. And like I say, it's not like it's never been tried before, because something sort of like that actually exists when it comes to architects. And that's it. I'm done with my presentation. So if you want to, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll take any questions you may have. I wouldn't mind if I could just have my picture on the screen now.
There you go. Well, I've got that going, and that was very nice. I appreciate that, and that was a good job of covering all those bases. One, I don't know if it was you that one time told me, but the one other great, analogy was, there was that surgeon who's operating on that person. So obviously something bad could happen. That person could die, but it's one person. But you're licensed and all that good stuff. But yet there's this pilot who's got this plane with hundreds of people on there, and they're certified. So it's like, they have far more lives at risk, because everyone could die in what they're doing. So, the certification has a lot more meaning, or like underwriter laboratory or AAA rating that local hotel or restaurant, than some, like you said, either
Right.
something that's just trying to get money, and I felt the same way. I've been in insurance for health for a long time. They all that ongoing continuing education, which is the same slides I was shown last year. I had to pay money to get the privilege of looking at, that type of thing. So yeah, it's kind of comical.
Well, as far as the pilot example is concerned, actually, I see Roy Miller is one of our participants, and he knows more about this than me, since he's a graduate of the Air Force Academy and served in the Air Force. But I think we still have what's effectively a pilot's license. But
oh yes, I'm just saying, but that certification aspect of being able to manage that many people is really the more important thing.
Right, and I think you don't have to go to like a certain, you don't have to go to the Air Force, let's say, or you have to be a Navy pilot or something like that in order to get your pilot's license. You just have to convince the certifying entity that you have the right enough experience, and you're given different levels of certification. So it's something like that.
Well, in that argument too, with the medical school is X amount of years, like everybody learned or managed the same, but certification, somebody could certify in 2 years, others might take 5 years or whatever.
Right.
They certify at the rate that they're able to get there.
A great thing about private certifying agencies is they're looking for ways to certify more people. That's why the architects came up with these alternative pathways. I got a feeling that the architects, if they had their equivalent of I can't say this for sure, but I would have a feeling that their lobbying group, their equivalent of the AMA, I think it's called the AIA, probably wasn't too thrilled with letting people who didn't go to the trouble of getting a degree in architecture a certification as an architect. They probably, if you had asked them, they would have said, no, you got to go to architecture school like me. But the NCARB said, no, there are a lot of people who, they know enough about this, they could do this. Mm-hmm. And so those are things that happen when it's taken out of political hands and put in the private sector. Paul Roberts is raising his hand.
I see, and Charles too. Let me get Charles jump in first.
Well, I'll make a comment, Jeff, but there are some folks that have chatted questions. Maybe we can ask them to elucidate a bit on their comments.
Okay, there you go. Let's do a little
Sure.
bit. We'll see. I see Paul's got some comments. So why don't we start with you, Paul?
Oh, sure. Great presentation, by the way, Dr. Singer. Yeah. And thank you for contributing so much to the discussion. But I think that it's a great intellectual argument, and I think the checks and balances are there with certification versus licensure. So I'm on the same page with you. My question would be, do you think there's a public perception firewall with the licensing that we have to be concerned with at all? Is there any kind of barrier there that requires some attention, do you think, or not?
What do you mean by the public thinks if you're not licensed that you're not safe?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, I think the checks and balances are there, but my question would is more concerns, do we need to educate the public? And what would that entail?
Yeah, I definitely think that's the problem, because it's not as difficult to educate my medical colleagues, because as soon as, when I get that first initial shock out of them when I say we should end licensing, and then I say, well, wait a second, are you board certified? how did you get on the staff of Honor Health Hospital? And I start running through all the examples of all these checks that they had to go through. They see it, they understand that. But so many people, in the general public who aren't working in this, they just assume that's the licensing board. In fact, I've seen this in my past. A lot of people think the AMA is what is checking us for safety. I remember. I don't want to. I'm a perfect doctor. I've always had 100% satisfied patients. Okay, but I remember a friend. I'm being sarcastic here, of course. There were times in the past when I get a nasty letter from a patient who said, "I'm going to report you to the AMA," and I didn't even belong to the AMA. But anyway, so there are a lot of people who think it's the AMA that is guaranteeing safety. So we do need to educate the public.
Yeah, and if I could just add something, because I was working at Tampa General, in the NICU when I saw a colleague of mine cleaning the incubator, and we were just kind of talking, and I was saying, well, I'm surprised, because she was a little older, and usually it's younger folks on that kind of job, and she was saying that she was a doctor in Mexico. And she, had immigrated, and that's, basically all she could do at the time because of the restrictions, with practicing medicine in the United States.
When you think about all the talent that is not getting tapped into, there are people who, could you go to the other side of the world where they have a different culture, a different language, and pick up your roots and be prepared to start all over again, everything you did, and you know how demeaning that is. And we're not giving those kind of motivated people. We're denying them a chance to actually serve the public, which that's a gift. The other countries put all the money into educating those people. We complain about foreign aid. Here's reverse foreign aid. We're getting people who their education experience was paid for by another country, and our immigration and licensing regime is denying these people an opportunity to come here and help patients.
Yeah.
Todd, I see you have some good comments here. Maybe you can make a little verbal questioning. I have you unmuted there.
Me?
Yes.
My Dr. Singer answered my question about telemedicine. It's like I see a doctor at MedStar Georgetown occasionally. I live in Pennsylvania. From here on, the plan is for my appointments to be over the internet. And I don't think those doctors are licensed in Pennsylvania, as far as I know. But that's where we're going with this, and I imagine it'll be post-COVID because I only see them once a year. And so isn't the question, and I think you answered that kind of with the locus of care thing, where who is going to whom?
Yeah, the alternative is your state of Pennsylvania could pass a law saying we'll allow any licensed healthcare practitioner licensed by any of the 50 states to deliver telemedicine to Pennsylvanians. That's another way. But then that'll be great for people living in Pennsylvania, but if you live in Maryland, it doesn't help you out. So ideally, you could just have this, it's in keeping with the Commerce Clause. It's breaking down trade barriers, so you could just say locus of care is wherever the person's licensed. I don't have to, there's no barrier to a licensed business in California sending me a product. Why can't a licensed healthcare practitioner send me the product? I see Roy Miller has a question here about, as a step towards licensing, why not allow more authority to pharmacists? Same argument with respect to nurses, therapists, physicians, assistants, etc. Well, Roy, the problem is, like I was talking about earlier in the presentation, with licensing comes scope of practice. So the licensing board for medical practitioners says, this is what a doctor with an MD degree can do. And if you get a license as a nurse practitioner, the nursing licensing board says, we'd like nurse practitioner, or the pharmacy licensing board, we'd like pharmacists to be able to do X, Y, Z. So then the lobbyists for the nurse practitioners and for the, like in our case, the Arizona Medical Association, they work the legislature and say, you can't let pharmacists do that. That's dangerous. They're liable to kill people. So the legislature says, okay, we're not going to expand that scope of practice. So that's a scope of practice issue, but a scope of practice is sort of an outgrowth of the whole licensing issue. So as long as you have licensing boards, the licensing boards determine what the scope of practice shall be for the licensee. And of course, that's all about politics and sausage making. Get rid of licensing boards, you can get a situation where a certification board, you could be a pharmacist and you can go before the certification board that certifies primary care doctors, and you can convince them that you could do a whole lot of things that primary care doctors do. You can give vaccinations, you could check for strep throat, you could prescribe the antibiotic if they have a positive strep throat, because you know as much about medications as any MD does because you're a pharmacist. So if you can convince them and show your experience, you might get certified in primary care by without having to go to medical school. Those are the kind of possibilities that open up when you get rid of the licensing boards. What you're basically doing is you're privatizing the issue of who's qualified to do what and taking it out of the hands of the politicians and the different rent seekers.
Yeah, the influencers. We've got time to slip in one last question. We're
Okay.
virtually out of time, but Abigail, you had some great comments. Maybe you can kind of sum it up to a good question at this point.
Okay. I love the idea of getting rid of licensure. It has caused a great deal of problems for people on the ground. I do state health policy here in Michigan, and I think we're one of the worst in many ways with licensure. I think we can't underestimate the force of the insurance and hospital lobbies. They basically want all clinicians to be employees without the professional autonomy. I honestly, I think they're even bigger in licensure and certification, honestly, than the individual professional lobbies, such as the physicians against the nurses and the nurses against the pharmacists, like you've mentioned. I don't have a solution for that, except don't automatically go for national licensure, because the maintenance of certifications on physicians is one of the worst abusers of physicians in raising costs in healthcare because of mandates on certification, increasing them so that every pediatrician has to have a specialty certification, and it can't be lifetime anymore. It has to be first they did every 10 years, and then it was every 2 years. And it can go up to thousands of dollars for those specialty licenses. So it's not a cheap thing either. Plus all the educational requirements that they load on. And you talk about rent seekers, there are some really bad ones.
I agree with you. The only thing worse than decentralized 50 state licensures is one central national license. Then you really have, that's great if you're a special interest, because now you only have one target you have to work on, as opposed to having 50 different targets that you have to convince. So that's actually easier for the lobbyists. But I think if we went through a regime of certifications, I hate the maintenance of certification idea. I think it's a moneymaker for the boards. But of course, the boards are not a monopoly. And we're already seeing, like I said, like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, they're competing boards, and they're all certified by certifying entities. I mean, they're all accredited by accrediting entities that accredit boards. And I think what would happen if we had certification as opposed to licensing is you see a whole lot of healthcare practitioners seek certification from boards that don't demand these onerous MOC requirements that a lot of them do now. And you'd have much more sort of customer-oriented certification. Like I said, like happened in the architect example, because the boards are actually trying to get people to seek their certification. That's why they had an incentive to come up with alternative pathways for those who didn't graduate with architecture degrees. So I can see the same thing. I mean, this is a process. It's not going to happen overnight. In fact, we're not going to even replace licensing with certification overnight. That's why I kind of point to the architecture example as a way to make a transition. And it makes it easier when you say, this isn't the first time it's been done. Look at the architects have been doing this for years. So that's why I use their example.
It's a perfect thing to do. Well, unfortunately, we're definitely after our time slot here, but that was really super. And I want to thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
One of the things that we can kind of help bring to bear, and what was nice about what you were talking about is that there's very much a decided path to go on. Some of the stuff we end up talking about, it's a mixed bag where to go. So it's been nice to see that, we just got to kind of execute and convince the right people to get there. But there's the ideas, as you said, a lot of it has to do with initial, individual initiative. And this is what this represents. This is the beginning of the transformation. And this has been out since the end of last year. This is another one of the organizations we're sponsored along with that is delivering cash patients and cash doctors. So it's fulfilling the name of this show we've been doing for years. Somebody actually has executed, and not surprisingly, a doctor invented this because they understood, and just in essence, why am I billing $300 to collect $70 and it takes me 90 days to do it? Couldn't I just get the $70 and call it a day? And this really facilitates that. And it's as simple as this little handful of tiles that you look at, and it allows you to get on the marketplace and sign up for some services. And if I'm looking to book and find a doctor, I get up there and search around for appointments. And as a quick analogy, it's like being at the corner where there's 4 gas stations and I can see that they're all selling the same gas, but one's 10 cents less. I think I'll go there. So the market is allowing us to reward the doctors that are quality and sharp on price. And if all the rest are getting frustrated, they go, well, I'm going to get to be $5 less than that other person. And we start to figure out what the prices really are supposed to be. And then you get to keep your medical charts. And then also it's so nice you have a wallet, which can be filled by your employer or by you, or maybe your health savings account, or any number of ways. So you've built a little hub here to manage all your healthcare and jettison the need for government or for insurance. So this is a great little thing to be aware of. And for those who want to get a little more information, there's a special website they put together for us, wowadvocates.com, and a great little video, and you can click and just get a little more info. You'll find all about it. So that's what we have for that part of today. But now for everybody that's here today, because we've ended the recording part, let's talk for a quick minute who's coming up so those that are here can make plans. And just before I do, we're on our new site, is also out here, and this is part of it. And there's a variety of tabs with tons more coming, but you'll notice here that we're promoting all the links to the channels for these series. Here's the list of who's coming. So this was today. Here's Dr. Singer right here. And then here's who was last week, and links to those videos. And then here's a list of who's forthcoming here. So you'll see there's a bunch of stuff under all sorts of other tabs on here. There's a lot of fun stuff to go look at. But let's get in very specific. So Charles, why don't you give us a fast rundown on who's coming here?
Sure. So in our continuing complaints about this COVID hysteria, we have James Lyons Weiler next Wednesday on the COVID testing fiasco. And this could be the fatal flaw